thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this interesting conference. To me, it's always, as a biologist, it's always fun and rewarding to interact with you clinicians to identify new areas of research. What I'd like to talk about today is Bachmann bundle as a potential perpetuator and definite complexifier of atrial fibrillation. First, I'd like to just show some more general information on our animal model, the goat model of AF, and what happens outside Bachmann bundle. So, as you know, atrial fibrillation, which is characterized by a rapid irregular atrial activation, with time, the stability of AF increases both in animal models and in many AF patients. And we can mimic this process in our goat model of atrial fibrillation. And in this model, we implant a pacemaker, and we pace the atrium at a rapid rate. And then within 2 weeks, this leads to persistent atrial fibrillation. But even after that time point, the stability of atrial fibrillation still increases. And we can look at that time course by testing the efficacy of cardioversion. So we give potassium channel blockers, prolonging the action potential. In the beginning of the disease process, after 3 or 4 weeks, this still works in a majority of animals. But in the following months, this is a serial cardioversion study, you see that after 4 months, in none of the goats, sinus rhythm was restored by this treatment. And we think that is because we have a gradual structural remodeling of the atrium. And one of the most important aspects of that we have identified is endomysial fibrosis. And that you can see here. So dark blue are the myocytes, light blue is fibrous tissue. And you can see that whereas after a couple of weeks of AF, myocytes are tightly packed together, after 6 months, there's increased separation of myocytes within bundles. And interestingly, this happens predominantly in the outer millimeter of the atrium. So you can see here the intermyocyte distances as a function of the distance to the epicardium. So here you're very close to the epicardial layer. And this is where you see this increase in endomysial fibrosis with months of atrial fibrillation. And that's interesting because that takes place in the outer epicardial shell of the atrium, which in most places is very thin, only 1 or 2 millimeters. So what we think, and this is just summarizing a lot of work we've done on this, is that endomysial fibrosis may lead to a loss of continuity of this epicardial layer, increasing the tortuosity of conduction pathways. We can directly observe that change in behavior with optical mapping. So this is a technique which you can use in perfused preparations, in which you load the heart with a voltage-sensitive dye, and essentially when tissue makes an action potential, you see that as a flash of light. You can see that after 3 weeks of atrial fibrillation, if you stimulate, the wave spreads in all directions with some degree of anisotropy. And after 6 months of atrial fibrillation, we see the effects of transverse uncoupling. So fibers have become separated in the transverse direction, still conducts very well in the longitudinal direction. And this uncoupling of fibers in the transverse direction translates into a more complex conduction during atrial fibrillation. So these are small areas in the left atrium. You can see that after 3 weeks of atrial fibrillation, the pattern is still very simple. Yeah, there are these large waves traversing the atrium. Whereas after 6 months of atrial fibrillation, the pattern has become much more complex. You see very small waves, especially when they conduct transverse to the local fiber orientation. They can go very slowly. And we think that because of this endomysial fibrosis and the concomitant loss of side-to-side connections, we have increased complexity of fibrillatory conduction and hence a increased stability of atrial fibrillation. And this would lead to a more complex three-dimensional pattern. So an important question, I think, is what keeps AF going in the first weeks or months of atrial fibrillation? So the early phase, when conduction in the atrial-free walls is still comparatively very simple. And we have had some evidence for a while that Bachmann bundle, the main connection between the left and right atrium, behaves differently. So Bachmann bundle was first described by Jean-Georges Bachmann already in 1916, but it took us almost a century to find out that it behaves quite differently during atrial fibrillation. And you can see that here in a study by Shan in our lab, where you can see that the electrical morphology is still simple and regular in the atrial free walls, but it's already very complex in Bachmann bundle. You see these fractionated electrograms. So what about the structure of Bachmann bundle? Here you see an anatomical preparation where the epicardial fibrous layer has been carefully removed, so you can nicely see the parallel fibers running from the right atrium, this is the SVC, to the left atrium. And because of this, it can act as a fast conduction pathway from the right to the left atrium. Histologically, you can see that it consists of these slender fibers, which can be separated by fibrous tissue over extensive lengths. It's also interesting that macroscopically, if you look at the fiber orientation, Bachmann bundle runs into the fibers of the atrial free wall at right angles. So Bachmann bundle on the epicardial side actually splits up. One part of the bundle goes to the pulmonary vein, one goes to the posterior side of the left atrial appendage. But on the endocardial side, Bachmann bundle continues into the network of the trabecular network of the left atrial endocardium. So to me, this structure is always a bit reminiscent of a tree with the roots in the right atrium, Bachmann bundle as a branch, and then the branches into the left atrium. So we've looked at the conduction properties of this area with high density mapping. So we've taken goats at 2 time points, 3 weeks of AF and 6 months of AF. So the time point of persistent AF, where cardioversion, pharmacological cardioversion still works, and the time point of permanent atrial fibrillation, where it doesn't anymore. And under general anesthesia with the left lateral thoracotomy, we've performed high-resolution epicardial mapping with 2 types of electrodes. A so-called spoon electrode, which we can place on either the right or the left atrium, and a specially designed hook electrodes, which we can insert around the aorta, and the electrodes on the outer curve are directly in contact with Bachmann's bundle. So what do we see after 3 weeks of atrial fibrillation? I've just found out, testing this slide, that when I press the upper figure, the audiovisual system here explodes, so I won't press that. I'll just describe what happens. So what you see is exactly what you would predict. The fibers are activated and you see a wave moving at high velocity from the right to the left atrium. Okay, so you believe that. What is more interesting is what happens during atrial fibrillation. And there you can see already at this early stage of atrial fibrillation that conduction is very complex. So you see these small, narrow waves propagating over Bachmann bundle. And if you look at it for a while, you'll probably be able to appreciate that most of them move in the longitudinal direction. Right? Makes sense. Also, if you look at the lines of conduction block, especially in the center of this area, so really the true Bachmann bundle, then you can see that they're mostly oriented at what's here being defined as 0 degrees, so parallel to the main fiber orientation of Bachmann bundle. So we've compared conduction properties of the free walls and Bachmann bundle. Some are not different between those areas, like the atrial fibrillation cycling, the activation cycling during atrial fibrillation. That's very similar between the atrial free walls and Bachmann bundle. The conduction velocity during atrial fibrillation, so the velocity with which fibrillation waves conduct, is not very different. And these don't change, these relations don't change too much when you look at a later time point. So AF cyclone becomes a little bit shorter everywhere, and a conduction velocity becomes a little bit slower in the free walls. But there is a much larger difference in behavior when you look at the complexity of conduction. So let's just first focus on the early time point. So this is 3 weeks of atrial fibrillation, where, as we've seen, we still have these very simple patterns of conduction on the atrial free walls. If you look at Bachmann bundle, as you could appreciate in that movie, there's already very complex conduction. So we've tried to quantify that, get measures of complexity, and of course these electrodes have very different shapes. So what we've done is to take similar areas of similar shape and size within the Bachmann bundle electrode and within the free walls. And there you can see that after 3 weeks, the number of waves per cycle, so a measure of the complexity of atrial fibrillation, is much larger. It's about a 3-fold higher in Bachmann bundle than in the atrial free walls. Also, the number of breakthrough waves is much higher in Bachmann bundle, so waves spontaneously appearing on the epicardium. And Bachmann bundle can accommodate a larger number of waves because the size of waves is much smaller there. And the size occupied by individual waves is much smaller. And you see a similar relation in the fractionation index. And that's an interesting measure, of course, because these require sophisticated analysis software. This is a more simple measure, the fractionation index. You can just tell by the electrograms that they're more fractionated in Bachmann bundle. So after 6 months, you see that the complexity of conduction is the same in Bachmann bundle. It increases in the free walls. The same holds true for the number of breakthroughs. And also the number of waves. The waves become smaller also in the atrial free wall. So in a sense, the atrial free walls are behaving more like Bachmann bundle, have an increased complexity of conduction. And you see that the fractionation index, the degree of fractionation of electrogram, agrees with that. So we think that the fractionation in Bachmann bundle actually is caused by the dissociated activation of these parallel fibers, where the different components of the fractionated electrograms reflect the dissociated activation of these adjacent fibers sensed by an electrode. This behavior is very pronounced during atrial fibrillation, but you can already get a clue during slow pacing. If you pace on or near Bachmann bundle, so if you pace somewhere on the posterior right atrial appendage, then a wave moves quickly over Bachmann bundle without hardly any block. But if you pace on Bachmann bundle itself at a slow rate, you can see these lines of conduction block, which can extend over long distances. So the maximum distance within individual animals we've observed is about 2 centimeters. So that's a considerable length along Bachmann bundle. So this again supports parallel fibers with sparse transverse connections. So a simplistic view of Bachmann bundle reflects this. So these are parallel cables with very few side-to-side connections, and for the rest they're separated by fibrous tissue. And during sinus rhythm, you don't really notice because they're all being activated at the same time. So the pattern is, you don't see any dissociation, but that's very different during atrial fibrillation, where you have narrow wavelets traversing the atrium. So that's a simplistic view of Bachmann bundle, but it is actually very close to what we see in optical mapping experiments. So this is an experiment where we've looked at a very small area, 1.5 by 1.5 centimeter of Bachmann bundle. So the left atrium is here, right atrium is here. The aorta would be up here. And during atrial fibrillation, you see very rapid conduction along the fiber orientation, slower transverse conduction, and a very dissociated pattern, so a very complex pattern. And we've been able to replicate this model in this behavior in a very simple tissue model of Bachmann bundle. This is work together with Christian Zemlin, where we've modeled Bachmann bundle as a bundle of parallel fibers with sparse transverse connections. And we see that for a range of connection fractions. So this is the number of units which is connected transversely. For a range of connection fractions, this structure is able to sustain re-entry with patterns very similar to what we observe in our experiments. And we've looked at more detail. I'll go through this slide very rapidly. It's quite complex, and we can talk about it during the break. We've looked at it in an even simpler model where we can look at the behavior of ionic currents. We know that from a classic study by Shaw and Rudy that longitudinal uncoupling leads to slow but very safe conduction, which is calcium dependent. But that's different if you consider transverse connectivity between fibers. This is work together with Yichao Zhao from Auckland. There, if you stimulate one fiber, you see that you quickly get very long delays between the fibers. And the relation between the currents also is different. So we need both the calcium current and the sodium current. You need a calcium current to maintain a plateau so that a sodium-dependent upstroke can take place in the non-stimulated strand. And that also would mean that this type of conduction might have a similar sensitivity, similar response to certain ion channel blockers. Okay, so in summary, after 3 weeks of atrial fibrillation, the Bachmann bundle harbors about 3 times as many fibrillation waves per area as the free walls, and the patterns we see are consistent with these long parallel fibers with sparse side-to-side connections, and we think this causes the high numbers we see at early stages of atrial fibrillation. So Bachmann bundle may be a pivotal perpetuator in the first weeks of atrial fibrillation, but of course the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So the question now is, will ablating the Bachmann bundle, will that help in restoring sinus rhythm? So just to summarize that in a picture, the transition of permanent of persistent to permanent atrial fibrillation. At first, there are these regions, because of their normal tissue structure, they show certain complex behavior. We have strong evidence, I think, that that's true for Bachmann bundle, but that may also be true for other areas where you have sparse side-to-side connections, like the crista terminalis, some areas in the coronary sinus musculature and between the pulmonary veins. We just don't know enough about the electrical connections in those regions. But then later on you get a dilatation of the atria and endomysial fibrosis, and more of the atria contribute, and that would be the stage of permanent atrial fibrillation. So I'd like to finish by thanking all the people who have contributed. The experiments I've showed were mainly performed by Al Stiles quite a while ago, and along with many other PhD students and our technicians, we have developed this thinking further. And we'll test ablation of Bachmann bundle together with Mark Lemaire and Girard Giraud, and I'm very excited about trying. Thank you.
Sanna, thank you very much. Let's see whether people indeed believe you. Questions from the audience?
First of all, congratulations. It's a very beautiful demonstration of the anatomy and the physiology about the conduction here. I'm a bit concerned about your approach about blocking conduction across Bachmann's bundle, because as you've beautifully shown, it connects the sinus node to the free wall of the left atrium and the appendage. Mm-hmm. In fact, we have actually tried that many years ago. We did anterior lines crossing from a roof line down to the mitral valve. And when we did that, we saw that the P wave in sinus rhythm splits dramatically far. You can have interaction, P wave to P wave of 300 milliseconds. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, you delay the free wall of the left atrium dramatically in sinus rhythm, which means that that part of the atria are activated when the normal P wave has finished, the QRS has finished. In fact, you have left atrial activation of the appendage after the QRS complex has happened. Mm-hmm. And that, sometimes if people extensively ablate, that happens actually even nowadays with cafes and all kinds of additional lines. And I'm very concerned because that means that the mitral valve is closed. The left ventricle is contracting. Mm-hmm. The valve is closed and you have contraction of the left atrium or part of the left atrium, which means you just can completely inefficiently have an atrial contraction that doesn't serve anything anymore. You're diminishing your atrial kick. Mm-hmm. So I think that is not a great idea. I think we should somehow get it back, and we might need, maybe with all your fancy mapping and systems, try to make that conduction go again yeah, in a fast and efficient way, because what we need in the end is a contracting atrium. It's not only rhythm cosmetics, I think, on an ECG. It's all very rough comment for me, and it sounds very aggressive, but I really think that we need to make sure that we restore what we really need to restore for AF patients, which is atrial contraction in a normal rhythm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that comment, of course, and it will be very important in these experiments, which we'll first do in goats, of course, to look very carefully at hemodynamics. There are other pathways between the atria, so they will be unaffected, so we'll only ablate or partially ablate Bachmann bundle and see what happens to hemodynamics. Maybe the relation between these pathways is different in humans. That would be the next step. So.
In humans, Bachmann's bundle is the fastest conductor.
Yeah, in goats it is too. Yeah, yeah.
What was just said, that comment I agree 100% with. That's precisely the reason there was a Maze 2. Because in the Maze 1 procedure, we had not one but 2 lines directly across Bachmann's bundle. And we saw such a long interatrial conduction delay that when we would bring them back to study, we found that the left atrium didn't appear to be contracting because it was contracting against a closed mitral valve. And the way we realized that's what was going on is Bruce Lindsay would put a catheter in the left atrium. And when you paced the left atrium, the atrium contracted fine. But it was just trying to contract at exactly the same time as the left ventricle was. So that's precisely the reason we went from a Maze 1 to a Maze 2, because of what she just said.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah.
When you think that further, that means that you have atrial contraction, you raise the left atrial pressure. In fact, what you do is you're creating pulmonary hypertension.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a good thing to have.
No.
I think we all agree that's
Yeah.
not a good thing to have. So I think we need to
Especially if the left atrial appendage has been removed. It makes it even worse. Then you have no compliance at all. That's right.
So I think we're creating, I think we are already creating quite a lot of those patients, but that is definitely a way of doing.
Yeah, so the idea of this ablation, which we'll try, is also not to completely disconnect the atria. So we will see how much we have to ablate. We just want to get rid of this complex conduction in Bachmann bundle. And that's part of the normal structure of Bachmann bundle. It's not a result of remodeling. So we have to partially ablate or modify conduction in Bachmann bundle so that it doesn't show this complex behavior and is not able to conduct to the atrium, to the rest of the atrium to that extent, without, of course, completely isolating the atria. That's a very good point.
Exciting discussion, but unfortunately we have to continue.
Well, maybe one last suggestion. Maybe longitudinally splitting it up in several bundles may be something to consider, because then you keep the AV, the right-left connection, but you avoid the re-entries within Bachmann bundle.
So what we see in the three-dimensional tissue model is if you remove all connections, when you get very low connection fractions, of course you don't get re-entry within the bundle because they just conduct completely separately. So that would be another approach. Yeah.